Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muñiz.
Now, as I might be mistaken, but I feel like some of our listeners might be studying. That's something I've learned recently, is that some of you guys out there are studying. And so, okay, that's not a surprise. But we wanted today to kind of like go through a bunch of different techniques for studying and talk about what's good about them and what's bad about them, and when you would do more of one thing versus another thing. Like, there's certain topics that I think, like, I would love to use flashcards for psych soc, but I don't think it's the best way to tackle like chemistry and physics, or even some biology stuff. And so, like, this is something that hopefully we can give a little bit of context. Like, I think all of these techniques we're talking about are things that they all have a place in this. I think that a lot of times what happens is students find one technique that works really well for one topic, and then they try to do that technique for everything. And that just because it worked well in this one case. And that is maybe not the ideal way to go through this, because there's different types of information. There's different ways of sorting it. You're going to get tested on these things in different ways as well. And so all of those things should factor in. All of these things should play a role in thinking, like, how are we going to test these? How are we going to study these different topics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times I've heard so many students come up, and, you know, I primarily do cars, so it's a little different, but so many students come up to me over the years and just be like, yeah, I'm doing this, and that. I'm like, okay, so let's backtrack a little bit and figure out what you're using each study method for. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be just as important, if not more important, than just trying to brute force your way through any one single study method that feels most comfortable to you. So we talked about flashcards not too long ago, and we do have our Jack Westin flashcard interface up on the website. And I mentioned that I'm someone that struggled with flashcards, and I think for a couple of reasons. So, but also flashcards have their place, and that's what we're going to talk about. So flashcards, like you said, something like psych soc, flashcards are great for when you need to just memorize something. That's when flashcards come into play, right? And so there have been times where over the years, especially in med school, once I've gotten here and I started learning how to use them a little bit more efficiently and effectively, it was like, okay, I have things I can use flashcards for, right? And I'm someone that definitely, I'm someone that likes to handwrite things a lot. And so you will see sticky notes all over my desk. You will see notebooks filled. And I was not planning this, but I looked over to the side, and guess what I have on the side of my desk?
A bunch of flashcards.
A bunch of blank flashcards that I plan on using for studying for the things I need to just rote memorize. So this idea of, if you're going to use flashcards for things that you need to memorize, how are you going to use those flashcards? So sometimes for some people, handwriting them can be really helpful. That's easier when you have plenty of time and a contained amount of information that you need to learn. Right? So let's say you're someone that is studying full-time for the MCAT. You have 6 months, and you know that for this one particular topic, you struggle with memorization. That could be a good fit. But if you're someone that is studying full-time and working part-time, or a single parent, or just someone who has a family and, you know, or a significant other or something, in addition to just kind of a baseline heavy workload, you're not going to have the time. It's going to be really difficult for you to have the time to handwrite a bunch of notes, flashcards, and then you can't really take them with you. So if you're on the go, or one of those other conditions that I talked about, an app or something online is going to be a better fit for you in terms of flashcards. If I'm trying to study the relationship between different pieces of content, flashcards are going to be really tough and not very useful. And so that's why they might be a good fit for memorizing the formulas in physics, or memorizing the strong acids and bases in chemistry, but they're not going to be really helpful for understanding fluid dynamics, right? Or I know that's your favorite topic, so I had to throw it in there, Phil.
I was already thinking of examples for that before you even brought it up. So we're going to talk about it here in a second.
Yeah. So it's really important to recognize that, yes, flashcards have their place. You want to make sure that they are in a medium that is reasonable for you and that you can, fits whether you're at home versus constantly on the go. And also that you have a contained space and set of information that you're trying to learn from with using the flashcards.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of stuff there. Like it's good for memorizing definitions. And so that's why I think it's really good for psych, because you're going to have a question and let's say the answer is schizoid personality disorder. Your other options are going to be schizotypal, avoidant, dependent, antisocial, whatever. And so you just need to make sure that you know the differences between those. And so that sort of thing, I think flashcards can be really useful for. But like in terms of like understanding how something works, understanding like relationships and how things kind of go overall, I think that flashcards are not quite as useful for that, right? For example, bile, like you could put on a flashcard, bile is an emulsificant. It emulsifies the chyme, right? And like that is true, and you probably should know that. But you need to know why it's important to have an emulsifier. Like you need to understand like why this is a critical thing and what's going on with bile and what it's made out of. It's made out of cholesterol. And like you need to understand like, oh, so if I had a drug that made me poop out bile instead of reabsorb it, then I would need to make more bile, and I would need to make that out of cholesterol. And which means my cholesterol levels would drop. And so that drug that makes me poop out bile is a good drug to lower my cholesterol levels. And like, that's not something that I'm going to put on a flashcard, right? I know you could put it on here, but if you're trying to understand relationships, that's really useful. I also want to kind of take a moment for like equations. Like if your only goal is to memorize equations, flashcards, yes, we'll deal with that. But there's a lot of equations and you really need to understand these things, right? The continuity equation, which is one of the simplest equations on the MCAT, right? Q1 equals Q2, right? That's about as simple as an equation can get, right? Flow is equal to flow, right? Flow 1 equals flow 2. A lot of students will memorize that equation, but they don't understand it, right? That equation, they'll think that like if you have an artery and it's got a certain flow through it, if that artery vasoconstricts, the flow will be the same because Q1 equals Q2. Nope, not true, right? That is one of the most common misconceptions about fluid dynamics. And it's just because students memorize this equation and the way they memorize it, they think flows don't change. Like Q1 equals Q2, what that's saying is the flow in is equal to the flow out. So if you have an artery that's dilated, the flow into that and the flow out of it are going to be the same. If you vasoconstrict, well, the flow into that new vasoconstricted artery and the flow out of that vasoconstricted artery are going to be the same. That doesn't mean that the flow is the same in the dilated and the constricted artery. Like the flow changes in those cases, but the flow in and the flow out always have to be equal to each other. And so what happens is students memorize these equations, and then the MCAT in a classic MCAT way is throwing curveballs, right? They're throwing stuff at you that they know you've never seen before, and you have to have a really good conceptual understanding. You don't just need to know the equation for capacitors, right? Like that's not what you need to answer this question, because this question's asking like, what happens to the capacitance of a neuron membrane if you switch out the lipids in that membrane, right? Like you don't have an equation for that, but you need to know, with a dielectric or with a capacitor, if the plates get closer together, the capacitance goes up. And so if you have a membrane that's separating positive and negative charges, if that membrane gets thinner, then those charges get closer to each other. So the capacitance goes up. So it's about understanding how does a capacitor work, understanding how fluid dynamics works. And like, to be honest, you can memorize all those relevant equations with flashcards, but that's not going to help you answer a question when the MCAT throws curveballs at you. You need to understand conceptually, like, how does this work?
Yeah.
Right.
And to be clear, right, that flashcards with equations, that's going to be for someone that knows, oh, I need to use this, but I can't remember it. Or maybe I struggle with knowing the units that are in the equations.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff that
really
can be helpful
there. Yeah. Exactly. I would not use them as a like this is the only way I'm dealing with fluid dynamics is flashcards.
Oh,
that
no,
is
no,
a
no, no,
really bad strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you need to know like what are the units for flow, yeah, that's a good way to do that. The units for resistance to flow or units for viscosity, right? Like those can be really useful. And so there's a time and place for these things.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but flashcards can also be used as a memory cue. So you see them and it's a prompt that you can work through, but we're going to talk about that later. But that's mostly the gist that we wanted to touch base on with flashcards.
Yeah, and especially because they might give you like you're not going to always see that same prompt. Like the MCAT, because they're throwing curveballs, like you need to conceptually understand this. I do want to take one moment to kind of talk about handwritten versus app stuff. I liked handwriting, but it took way longer. I do think it is generally better to make your own flashcards than it is to use someone else's flashcards. It just takes way more time though, right? And that's the kind of like the two sides of this. We're going to talk about this more here in a little bit, but there's a big difference between passive learning and active learning. If you are making your flashcards, that is active. If you're using someone else's, that is passive. And so generally active is better than passive. But in the case of flashcards, active is a whole lot more work than using some flashcard deck that's, like 3,000 like cards or 6,000 cards that somebody else made. It's a whole lot easier to use those than make your own 6,000 cards. So we also have videos, and this is something obviously we have a lot of thoughts on. I think videos can be really good for explaining conceptually what's going on. So like, I think if you're trying to understand fluid dynamics, videos way better than flashcards for like that initial run through. But once again, like videos, I think are not good for that like rote memorization of just tons and tons of vocab, right? Like if I'm trying to memorize like a bunch of drugs, like if I'm in pharmacology in med school, or if I'm in, let's say I'm in undergrad, or I'm like, oh, say I'm studying for my MCAT, and I'm trying to memorize hormones, right? Like watching a video on all the hormones is probably not as good as me like making a bunch of flashcards to remind myself like what are the different hormones, or like creating a study sheet or creating my own tables to organize these things. But if I want to understand like what is a hormone overall and how does it work? What are the ideas behind this? Why is a steroid hormone different than a peptide hormone? Like videos are really good for that, for like understanding kind of conceptual things. Oh man, I have so many thoughts on this. This is something you should be asking yourself, right? Like when you miss questions, like what was the problem? Did I not understand how fluid dynamics works? Or did I not know what the units for flow was? One of those is fixed with a video. One of those is fixed with a flashcard. And so you really want to understand, okay, where was my problem? Right. So that helps you figure out what's the treatment for that. Just like in medicine, right? You got to diagnose before you can treat, right? Figure out what was the problem before you figure out how to fix that.
Yeah. And I really want to emphasize, like with videos, you want to have those connections, right? And I think I want to toss in podcasts there, like this one, right? Because we went through a lot of the psych-soc material. And so that's something that people traditionally think, okay, just rote memorization. And yes, flashcards can help with that. But part of what can make it memorable is those connections, is the stories behind, the different disorders, or, the books that the TV show that I was watching that, was diagnosing the main character. That's a little different. Right. And so you want to ask yourself, is the video or the podcast, whatever it may be, that I'm using providing something in addition to reading the definition? Because if we just sit here and say, okay,
Absolutely.
Yeah. acids are, they donate protons, and bases accept them. And yeah, that's what that's not helpful, right? Because you can just read that.
Reading would be better in that case.
Exactly. But learning about how that relates to the bicarbonate buffer system in our blood, that's more engaging. And so that's where videos, podcasts, whatever, maybe again, can come into play, because even though it may be more passive, there's going to be more engagement than if you just need to memorize something and you're using flashcards for that specifically.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, right? And so, that's so good. Like if that question, that psych question that asks, like, what disorder does this person have that we described, right? That flashcards are really good for that. Now, if they ask a question on like, okay, how would a psychoanalyst view classical conditioning, right? That's a question that's not just, do you have these things memorized, but do you understand how these things can be related, right? And what's going on with these things. And so like psychoanalyst cares a lot about kind of like subconscious things and kind of below the surface, and classical conditioning, that's like Pavlov's dog stuff. And so understanding like, we can be trained to do things without realizing that we're being trained to do things, and like, because it's happening subconsciously, and like that's a more tricky question, right? And now don't get me wrong, you will see both of those kinds of questions. One of those like videos are really useful for. One of them, like flashcards, is maybe more useful for. But I think the other thing with videos is, and I think we try to do this, is we try to help students make connections between different topics, but also like with stories and examples that are very memorable, right? Things that are like experiences that you can kind of relate to, with examples of questions, so that you're thinking about how this can be tested, like we literally just did, right? With the psychoanalyst and classical conditioning. It kind of helps you see those connections overall.
So the first two things we talked about are passive. This next one is also passive. And this is the one that most students are familiar with in their undergrad institutions, undergraduate learning. That's reading a textbook or reading some written format. And the reason that we say this is passive is, again, you are absorbing, but you are not producing. And so that's really what it comes down to in terms of active versus passive. So when you're just reading a textbook, right, you may or may not be able to stay engaged. I struggle with reading textbooks. If my life depended on it, we would have a problem, very much so, because I can't sit down and read for extended periods of time. I'm that kind of person that I will be halfway through a paragraph and I'm like, what the first part saying? And have to go back.
Like glaze over. Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas a different type of passive, which is videos, is a better fit for me. And so in that case, it's because the connections are coming quickly. Whereas with a textbook, there may be a buildup of connection, or to the connection, right? There's going to be a lot more filling in the gaps. Generally, a textbook will have more of those smaller details than a video. And so when you need to you need a deep dive into something, that's where a textbook can be helpful, right? That and that's different than a video, which generally a video is going to be shorter, and it's going to be generally higher level, more like you said, more conceptual. So really thinking if I have a topic that I'm like, I need to start from scratch, right? And I need that very high level conceptual, I might start with a video and then switch to a textbook. Or if I'm realizing, I actually have the general idea down, I need to get more into the granulars, that's where reading a textbook might be helpful.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Absolutely.
And just like, if you're just trying to conceptually understand stuff, you can figure that out from a video or a book. I think either way, it kind of depends on the book, depends on the video, right?
Yes.
But that being said, like both can be very passive, and generally active is better than passive, right? And so that's why, like a lot of students, like myself included, like reading a textbook did nothing for me unless I was giving myself a task to organize this information. And so I would like highlight in a textbook, but I specifically, like I had my own system where I had like different color highlighters. I have yellow and green and pink. And I would go through and I would like highlight diseases in yellow and symptoms in green and treatments in pink. And I would go through kind of all of these things. Anytime I wrote about anything in sympathetics, I'd write it in red, and anything in parasympathetics, I'd write it in blue. And so like I would kind of like going through kind of like taking notes and organizing this information. And so I would go through the entire chapter and like highlight all the relevant stuff. And then I would go back through and come up with like a list of like, oh, okay, here are all the diseases. Here are all what causes them. Here's all the treatments. Here's how you diagnose them. And like you're kind of like organizing this information. And that's way better for long-term retention than just reading. I made some big mistakes when I went to med school at first, where I was just doing passive. I was just watching videos and I was just reading and I was not taking any notes. I was reading other people's notes, which is also passive. And like, that's not going to stick with you very well long term. That sort of stuff works well short term. So if you need to like if I need to learn something in the next hour for a test in 2 hours, right? Like reading through the chapter really good, probably not a bad thing. But if I need to study today for something weeks from now or months from now, organizing that information helps. And I know I know you're in the midst of doing some pretty serious studying here. So I feel like you might be the I don't know, the poster child for these different kind of techniques and things.
I have so much I want to say. We just talked about procrastination not that long ago, a few episodes ago. But yeah, so what I love that you shared your experience about highlighting because it's so different from mine. So in your case, you were highlighting actively and you were actively studying because you were determining the importance of information, the chunk, right? The association of the information as you were going through. That may not be everyone's experience. Some people maybe guilty of what I have generally been guilty of. And it's you basically highlight the whole page. Yeah. And it's just like, oh, everything feels important, but there's no actual analysis of importance. There's no analysis of a hierarchy of what's, most important versus less important, what's most conceptual, which definitions do I need to know, what relationships I need to know. And so in that case, highlighting, if you're someone that leans towards that and you're just highlighting everything that comes your way, that leans actually more towards passive because you're not getting anything new out of it. You're just kind of running with the highlighter. Yeah. And so you have to ask yourself because we have two very different experiences, and what you have to ask yourself when we talk about these different study methods is, where am I when I use these study methods, right? Because you can convert videos and textbooks into a more active form of studying, which we're talking about now. And for Phil, that's what you did, right? You turned your reading your textbook into more active when you were highlighting. But if you're someone that you're like, I actually don't do that, right? I run out of highlighters very quickly, then that's something that you need to change, because that's not helpful, right? It's kind of like with cars. You don't want to highlight the whole passage, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's not helpful. I won't get into my car spiel, but know that it's in my heart.
No, we definitely do that in the sciences as well in the course. Yeah. I'm like, okay, is this sentence important and testable or not? This whole paragraph is useless. This paragraph has 4 ideas that are testable, and identifying those as you're reading is important.
Exactly. So this is where, when you're studying, right, we talked about highlighting potentially being active for some people if you're being smart about it. There's another way to turn textbooks, and both textbooks, videos, and podcasts into a more active form. And that's taking separate notes. So as you're watching a video, as you're, listening to the podcast, or maybe after you listen to the podcast, right, you go and you write out some notes. When you're reading from the textbook, you're jotting things down on the side. So like you were saying, it actually sounded like you incorporated that while you were studying, in addition to the highlighting, right? You were writing things for the sympathetic nervous system in red, that activation, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic system in blue, right? That calming effect.
Yeah, blue is calm, red is action. Like that's just what was going on in my head.
But, in those cases, you are turning something passive into something more active. And so for me, I already mentioned reading a textbook and we're just never going to mesh probably. Flashcards, I have a back and forth relationship with. There are times where I use them and there are times where I'm like, nope, that's not it. Videos for me have been a very useful way to work through material, because I also read slow. And like I said, I have its attention is trouble. But what I find is that I watch the videos and I have a notepad next to me and I'm writing things down. And those are the things that are most salient, the things that I'm like, ooh, I know I need to actually go back and get more information on this in depth that I'm going to come back to and fill out the rest of it, right? So I'm identifying what's important and my weak areas that are important enough to target, right? Because we talked about this in the past, not every weak area should be targeted at the same time. Or with the same degree of intensity, because if something is high yield and it's a weakness, you're hitting that, right? You're amino acids and you're struggling, you need to go back to amino acids.
Forget everything else.
Exactly.
Just do that.
Exactly. Whereas, if you're struggling with like the lens equation compared to amino acids take priority, then you can go back to optics.
Yeah. Or any orgo, because orgo is just
any orgo. Exactly. Yeah. And so it comes back to that idea when you're watching a video, when you're reading a textbook, when you're listening to something, don't just stop there, make it active. And so for some people, for me, I think the fact that I have physical flashcards will speak to this. I'm someone that needs a lot of handwritten things. Typing, it's very difficult for me to process while I'm typing, and I also tend to type slowly. But for some students, typing is the way to go. They can get it right there, and then they like being able to control F and then being able to edit as they go through, and that's fantastic. And then for some other people, handwritten notes are going to be more helpful. Again, keeping in mind what you need these for. So this is going to be good. A little less so for just rote memorization, but good for conceptual things, identifying what's important. These notes can be very helpful. When you're deciding between typed versus handwritten, yes, think about what works for you. And again, also consider whether you need to be mobile while you're using these different, like if you're going to review your notes, right? So these are all important things to take into consideration when you're deciding what combination of these things am I going to use.
Yeah. And there's so much going on here. I'm like having so many flashbacks to med school as we go through here.
Another episode on med school learning.
On just like what worked and what didn't work. Yes. And I think that there's a lot of things that I learned in med school that I wished I would have learned earlier about how to study. So that's kind of what's going on here. We're giving you guys a leg up. You guys are getting to skip some of the pain that we went through, and you guys can start using these things earlier. But this active stuff is really important. My mind tends to wander, right? I'll like be like sitting and just randomly kind of go off. And if I'm reading and just reading, like all of a sudden I'll like finish like the chapter. I'm like, I don't remember anything from the last half of this chapter. I just kind of totally glazed over. I read it, but I don't remember it. There's a lot of books that I have read for fun. And now if somebody asks me like, what was the main character's name? Like, I got no idea. Right. Like I got nothing for that. I don't know the plot. I don't even know the character from there. But like, I think that's because that's a very passive thing. And that stuff that sticks with you better is when you are being active. And what I mean by active is you are organizing the information in your head. I think that if you are reading a chapter or watching a video and you're just writing down everything that they say, that's not active. That's actually really passive. It's a lot more work, but it's also passive.
Yeah, like highlighting everything.
Right. Yeah. Like highlighting everything. Exactly. And that's why like taking notes is important. And I also think like making like guides or making materials. And so like when I would finish a chapter, I would like have everything highlighted. I'd take all that information. I would make my own tables, right? I would make my own figures that weren't in the book, right? I'm not just copying this down, but I'm trying to figure out how do I organize this information. And a lot of times I would make a table and I'm like, oh, there's a way better way to make this table. Like I should have focused more on this or that. And like, but like, if you are at the point where you can look at a table of like hormones and like, oh, like this table is not super well made because they should have focused more on this thing. Like that means you know the stuff really well. This is a common thing. There are some students out there that have made some really great materials. Like there are students that I've had that have made great tables and figures and charts and like ways of like understanding psych and vocab lists and things like that. And those students do really well. And I think a lot of students are going to say like, oh, they did really well, so they were able to make those tables because they're really smart and they were on top of it. When actually it's the flip, right? they did really well because they made the tables, because they went through that extra kind of work of organizing the information. And this exactly, I know I've talked about this at least like 3 or 4 times over the course of this podcast and over the course of, other stuff that I've done, free trial sessions in the course and things like that. But when I first went to med school, like the first couple of months, I was trying to do everything passive and I was not doing well. And I was spending way more time. I'm like, I don't have any more time. I'm spending 16 to 18 hours every day studying and like sitting in class. And I just don't have more time. But it was because I was like watching the lectures and rewatching and reading the chapters and reading other people's notes. And I wasn't organizing information in my own head. And so that when I made the flip to all of a sudden, okay, I'm going to quit doing that. I'm not using anyone else's notes. I'm going to make my own like tables that are not in the thing. And I'm going to make my own figures. I'm going to draw the pterygoid fossa in like my own depiction and the nerves kind of coming in and out and understanding.
Oh,
those of you who are in head and neck anatomy, you're going to be like, oh my God, that's the worst. But it's strange because I can still draw this. I can still like, after all of this time, it's been over a decade and I still know it because I organized this information in my head, and that makes it stick, right? That makes it like something that you understand conceptually if you can go through this. And so making your own guides, I think, is big. At least for me, that is probably the most important thing that I did. There are students that I have had that have been really good on the MCAT are students that have organized the information themselves. They're not just copying down what other people have said. They're organizing information on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like the last 3 things that we have mentioned, or the last 3 things that we have mentioned, have the potential to be either passive or active depending on how you use them. Yeah. Right. So we already went through a spiel with
like highlighting, note taking, and then figures, right?
Exactly. So highlighting, if you are highlighting the whole book, passive, not helpful. If you are determining what's important and deciding the information as it relates to each other and knowing that you're going to use that,
sort it.
Exactly. Sort it. That's active. With taking separate notes, if you're just writing everything on the video from the video, that's passive, right? But if you're, like we talked about earlier, kind of triaging as you watch the video, knowing that maybe there's some things you're going to come back to, or what's, highest yield, things like that, that's active. With the review guides, it is the potential, again, to be both. If you are just copying, like you said, if you're copying those tables from the textbook, that's passive. You're not actually creating anything new. Whereas I completely agree. The review guides were honestly game changing. And I wish I would have started doing them even honestly in undergrad when I was in my like biochem classes and whatnot, because I feel like that would have made life so much easier from the beginning, especially because the stuff that you learn in biochem never fully goes away. Let me tell you that right now. As a third-year med student, has never gone away. And so, that's the kind of things that will stick. And one of the really beautiful things about review guides and study guides, I'm a huge proponent of them, is that they do not exist in isolation or in a single moment, right? So when I read the textbook, I might have just notes, but if I haven't put them together in a clear way and connected them with other information, it's incomplete. Whereas with the review guide, I am making those connections. I might place review guides and study guides that are related to one another next to each other, so I study them together. Or I know I might be someone that I need to move a lot. Clearly, I'm someone that needs to move a lot. And so I would take my study guides and walk while I was reviewing them. If you need some sunshine because it's dark out and you need a midday break, take your study guides, go outside for a walk and review them. And something else that's really beautiful about these review guides, and something that I learned to take advantage of later on, is you can hand someone a review guide or send them a picture of it and then just talk out loud, explain it to someone else. And that's something that is absolutely active, right? But now you've incorporated 2 different study methods that are active: the creation of the study guide, and now talking out loud, reasoning through. And in the case, if you give it to someone else or send them a picture, they can just make sure you talked about the stuff. They don't actually have to know, right? My mama, the amount of time she just listened to me talk, having no idea what I was talking about. And then she'd be like, did you say this? And I'd be like, yeah, I did say that. Okay, we're good. You said everything. Yeah. Is really helpful. And so that doesn't mean that you have to have someone that you're talking to every single time, right? Because obviously I couldn't get on the phone with my mother every time I wanted to talk with her and have her listen to me talk about ridiculous science stuff. But you can just talk out loud. And I know there's always like, oh, like the person's talking to themselves. So what?
Yeah.
So what? Talk and reason through these ideas out loud. And as you're talking out loud, you might realize, oh, I don't actually know that. Oh, wait a second. I thought I knew that. I'm going to have to look that up again because I forgot, right?
Yeah.
There's so much that you learn as you are talking out loud that you won't realize if you're just in front of a computer, sitting, thinking, talk, please.
As people who make a lot of videos, as I know you can relate to this of like, I'll sit down to make a video and I'll go through and I'll hit this point. I'm like, wait, was it this thing or that thing? Like, now I'm confused. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that as well as I thought I knew that. I need to go back and like redo this. I kind of feel like I shouldn't have said that because now people are going to be like, oh, these people don't know what they're talking about. But I think anytime you make like hundreds and hundreds of videos and like, 1,000 hours of videos, you're going to come across something like, ooh, it's been a couple years since I looked up that technical definition, right? I know how the MCAT tests it, but like, what's the technical definition for it? Like we talked about depression and dysthymia recently, like exactly how many months or how many weeks do you need to diagnose depression, right? Like that's something I've lost that. I know the difference between depression and dysthymia. The MCAT's never going to ask you to do diagnose somebody on the MCAT. Like they're never going to do something like that, but you do, some of those little things kind of go away, but you've got the big kind of like understanding, how the MCAT's going to test. You can kind of go through all of this, but I had a student that would like had a Post-it note and they drew a face on it and they like named it like Steven and they just like stuck it to the wall and they just explained everything to Steven and going through that process really, really helped. This kind of relates to study group stuff. And like, I think it is good to have a group sometimes to like have and talk to somebody. I'm gonna really lay out like what changed my trajectory. When I was kind of struggling, I was doing everything passive. And then all of a sudden I'm like, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to meet up with my friend, Kristen and Joe, and like all these people who are in med school that I'm like really good friends with. We're going to break up these different topics. I'm going to cover one topic and then I'm going to teach it to them. And so I would make my own tables that were not in the book and I would give them those tables and I would explain it and teach it. And I would do diagrams up on the board. And to be honest, the reason I did this is because that's what I did in undergrad to learn is like, I would create study groups and I would like kind of like lead the study groups and it's not because I knew it better. It's like I needed to lead the study groups so that I would know it better. And there was something about this accountability of like, if I don't study this and I do bad, I mean, that sucks, but that's not the worst thing in the world. If I don't do my work and Kristen does bad and Joe does bad, that's a bigger problem to me. I am not okay with that, right? Like I feel like a lot of me is kind of like service oriented. I'm like, I needed that accountability and like, okay, I need to make this table and I need to make this table really well because Joe really needs to understand this. And so does Kristen. And it's my job to do that. And so we would all kind of like make materials that kind of went back and forth. And so this is a lot of active stuff, but it's also study groups. And to be honest, it was a lot more fun doing that than like sitting in a library studying for 6 hours. I'd rather make figures for 2 hours and then joke around with Joe and Kristen teaching it in class and like dirty jokes and mnemonics to help them remember stuff. And like, that's way more fun and it sticks with you way better. And I think that is a really important thing of like understanding this active versus passive is a big part of that. Now, don't get me wrong, passive is easier. And there are sometimes I think just going through someone else's flashcards is fine. But if you want to remember a lot of like really complex relationships and understanding of how things like what is like understanding nuclear fusion and fission and mass defect and how that stuff works. Like that's not just flashcards, right? Like that's something that you should that's maybe a bad example. Nuclear physics is really complex. But like fluid dynamics. Let's go with that. That's easy. No, that's still complex. But like understanding that stuff, I think a more active strategy is a better way to deal with it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think with the study group, some people might be thinking, okay, but then it's passive for the other people because they're just listening. Yes and no. There is a passive component, but they get to interact. They get to ask questions. They get to write down the pieces that they think are most important. And so even if it's active for you and maybe a little passive at times for them, it quickly becomes active for everyone. And so that's something to think about when you're thinking, okay, can I get a study group? Because also we recognize that it's not feasible for everyone, right? Depending on where you are, but maybe you can make some virtual study groups, and that accountability there can be really helpful too.
Join the course, go to office hours.
Honestly, yeah.
Really
so
great example of that.
I love that people are just like there. A couple months back when, before people were testing, like people just tell their stories of like what they were doing and what they were baking. And like, there was just this camaraderie, which is beautiful. It just it just brought me so much joy. And then people were answering each other's questions in the chat if I like wasn't talking fast enough, which is shocking because sometimes I talk fast.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry. I just really care about.
That's a perfect example of them teaching each other. Yeah. And like, that's what we try to create and like understand that like, that's actually a good way for these students to learn and retain stuff long term. 100%. There's a lot of students that would go to office hours, even if they had no questions,
they still do
because they wanted to participate. And like, that's something, yeah, exactly. Like there's a lot of students that go to every single office hours because they want to interact. They want to talk to me about chemistry and physics. Generally I do those office hours on Tuesdays. And so that's, just kind of a fun, interesting thing to help us kind of understand this in the context of stuff. So it's really important, just kind of putting all of that stuff together. A lot of this, once again, it is possible to do all of these things passive. You can be in a study group and not contribute and just listen to other people talk and just read and just watch videos, but that is not as good as the active stuff. I also want to really hammer this, and I think this is why this hit me so bad in med school, is that especially in undergrad, a lot of the tests are testing you, hey, like I told you this war happened on this date because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. And so that's going to be a question just verbatim, right? And like that doesn't take understanding. That's just memorizing facts. They told me this and now they're testing me on it. The MCAT is not like that. The MCAT is about understanding. And so active becomes way more important than just rote memorization of a list or a list of facts or definitions. And so that's something that I think is critical for students to realize, that the way you're being tested is changing. And so you need to change the way that you're studying if the old way is not going to work for this. So that's a big thing.
Yeah. And honestly, that also segues into you have to change how you're studying, but you also need exposure to how you're going to be tested. Exactly. How you're going to be
tested. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's probably one of the most active forms. You can't passively take a test, right? You can't passively do some practice questions, which is why in multiple podcasts, we've talked about this. On the Jack Westin website, you'll see that we have daily passages for free in the sciences and cars, because you need that level of active, that active studying.
Yeah. And this is why we kind of need this, like, exams. And we talked about this, I think a month ago, we talked about the testing effect, like roughly a month ago. But like, this is also a critical portion. Like, you need to be quizzing yourself, and this helps you understand how you're going to get tested. So then maybe you can go back and recover information, but in a different way and a different light to try to like make those connections. This is obviously a big part of prepping. I think that practice questions and full-length exams are more important. Like, they get more important the farther you go and the closer to test day you get.
Yep.
That's why we recommend every student to take like basically a test a week as they approach their actual test day. So like at least the last 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks, doing an exam every week. It kind of depends on the student's schedule. If they're only studying for 2 months, then okay, you probably only got like 6 weeks is still a lot of time to be doing exams. So you might need to crunch and like readjust. If you're studying for 6 months, which I think is a much healthier way to approach this, then yeah, like the last 6 weeks, maybe the last 8 weeks, the last 2 months-ish, I would spend just doing an exam a week.
Yeah. And again, this is to be very clear. We've said this before, and I just really want to make sure we emphasize this. Practice questions do not replace learning the material and building the concepts, right? That's application. But for you to have effective application, you need to know what you're going to be applying. And so you can't just do questions and expect to do well on the exam. That's not going to work for most people unless they have a really strong background in the content already. And so that's really important to keep in mind. When I was studying for my shelf exams, so context. So the shelf exams are the exams that you're going to take in medical school that are specific to a specialty. So like you're going to take a neurology exam, you're going to take one for OB-GYN, psychiatry, whatever. I shouldn't say whatever, but those and more. And so
those three, or the other ones that are less. No,
I think neurology stuck with me because it was the first one and it was low key traumatic.
I remember you going through that one and talking about it.
As you can tell, Phil and I, we have conversations outside of this, but yeah. So when I would start with videos. I would start with taking notes. I would maybe do a couple of questions here and there early on, but I would not sit down and take an exam at the very beginning. But life happens, clinics happen, and you don't always get to do everything that you wanted to do and watch every single video and read every single article that you wanted to. And so as test date got closer, I switched because at that point, I didn't have time for passive. Passive was not going to get me a passing score, right? When I had a decent amount of the information down packed to switch to practice passages, and they're not practice passages, practice questions. You can tell MCAT's in my pores at this point. But yeah, and I switched and I would do practice questions because at that point, passive wasn't enough. I needed to immerse myself in active. And that goes back to what you were saying with the MCAT. Start off with a mixture of passive and active in the form of learning content. And then towards the end, you're almost exclusively you should be doing exclusively active in the form of a combination of review, right, et cetera, going back, fine tuning things, and the practice exams, both of those being active rather than passive.
Yeah. And if you've got the time, I know that this sounds like, oh, okay, Phil, I'll just also build a rocket and go to the moon. But like, if you were going to kind of like, if I was going to start from scratch studying for the MCAT and I didn't know everything, I would probably start off with the goal of I'm going to make an MCAT prep book or like something that's like building a rocket to go to the moon. But like, I'm going to build figures. I'm going to build diagrams. It's not going to be complete and it's not going to be perfect, but me organizing that information is going to make me do way better than if I try to just read everything, right? Like reading everything, even if you got to everything, is probably not going to be as useful as building your own study guides for 80% of the information or 70% of the information. And so I think that's a really, really big thing. And the other cool thing about the practice questions and the exams is, let's say I thought I conceptually understood all of this stuff. I take I do some questions like, oh, I don't know nephrology as well as I thought I did. I don't know hormones. I don't know immunology as well as I did. So I need to go back and kind of like go over this. And maybe I need to make some more figures or make some more stuff or talk to Steven on my wall about immunology a little bit more. But like all of those things are like, you're not done with that when you move to the practice questions and exams, but the practice questions and exams, you can use this diagnostic tools to figure out, okay, what stuff do I need to go back and relook at? I know I kind of poo-pooed organic chemistry because orgo is less than 5% of your exam compared to like, if you take just bio and cars, that's a third of the test, right? Orgo is less than it's like 5%. But like if you do an exam and you miss 9 questions, but 5 of them were orgo, you should go back and study orgo. You should go back and like focus on that. So you want to use the exams as well to kind of like make smart decisions in terms of how to spend your time. I know I talk about this way too much. in the podcast and in classes and things like that, but that's because a lot of students don't do that. Like your exams are the most important diagnostic tool you have. You need to treat them as diagnostic tools. They're not just there so you can get an idea of what score you're going to get. Like those are tools to help you be more prepared for test day. It's as critical as an X-ray is to a physician, right? So you need to make sure that you need to understand, okay, what is this information telling me and what do I do with that information?
First, you like to pick on nephrology and kidneys.
I think it's because that's the thing I struggled with the most, like when I was going through this. Like I hated the kidneys. I don't know why. All those things, kidneys and immuno and endocrine, those are my least favorite.
I hope our immunology podcast changed your thoughts at least a little bit on immunology.
Maybe. I'm a physics guy. I'm a breathing, heart rate. I'm a cardio pulmonologist. I want things with physics and forces.
That's fair. X-ray is to fracture, and physician as diagnostic exams are to knowing what to study, how to study, and being efficient at studying. So we've covered a lot of ground today. And if you listened to the podcast, this is your chance to go take some notes, figure out, make it active, and figure out what you are doing and what you might need to change. And maybe you are one of those people that you have everything set up, and that's fantastic. Thank you for staying and listening. But most people, like myself and like Phil, when we were starting out, don't have that kind of stuff figured out. And so figure out, okay, am I using flashcards? Am I using them for the right thing? Am I I didn't mention this. Flashcards. Flashcards, what you can do is you can use them to decide what topic you're going to talk out loud about. That's the other thing I wanted to mention with the memory cue, and using them as a cue to just talk about something and just pick something and then just go off on a tangent. Okay, this is the lens equation. I'm going to say everything I know about lenses, and just kind of shuffling and doing that. But figure out what you're doing, what you should be doing, what you can do reasonably in the time frame that you have, and that matches your needs.